The second place that was very clear at that stage, the first 30 years, is the masjid. As I said, the Maimuna started in a masjid. And when it moved to its new building, Habib's father built a house next to it. But he continued to be the Imam of the masjid. And it was in the masjid that Habib Abu Bakr learned how to recite Quran. It was in the masjid where he learned how to sing nasheed, because his father used to ask him to do that. It was in the masjid that he started training on giving speeches. It was in the masjid that he used to have the gatherings where he learned the Burda, where he studied many of the books. But then something happened. Something significant happened. Basically, the masjid was the hub of all activities. But something significant happened when Yemen became a Marxist regime. What is it? It was the arrival of electricity. Electricity came. And he acknowledges the importance of electricity and clean water, i.e., he acknowledges the importance of modernization. But when modernization creeps into the simple city or simple village or the minds of the villagers, it becomes a dangerous toy that is given to a child who doesn't know how to use it. So he sees modernization then as a toy that is being given to a child who has an immature hand and mind. He speaks of a hadith, very, very interesting hadith, and I'm going to read this. He speaks of the hadith of the insects that were lured by the glow of fire. You know the hadith about the butterflies or the night moth that sees a fire thinking that it is light, so they come and throw themselves in. And the Prophet ﷺ says, like, you come and throw yourself into the fire thinking that it is light and I'm protecting you. So Habib sees electricity and progress and modernization that comes to villages with simple minds, people who do not know the dangers of it. He says that this can be quite dangerous. He says progress, as I understand it, is not electricity. It's not water or material civilization. It's the understanding of the time, using its means while remaining intellectually independent. In this, we will see how we will perceive ilm al-sa'a and the end of times and modernization later on. He talks about imported ideas as opposed to imported products. So he opposes imported ideas, intellectual colonization, subordination. He saw the idea of progress coming on Western terms, modernization on Western terms, throughout the book as Orientalism, anthropology, secularization, and all of these. He blames this imported modernization for inciting simple-minded people to despise their tradition. So he does not oppose modernization, but he says modernization should not make us turn our back on our own traditions and roots with the manners and religious directives and beliefs. And he sees that progress is the one that can lead to being rooted in your tradition rather than divorcing your tradition. And then he mentions something that will explain to you why did he call his first volume The Shells and Reality. So he says that there was one big light in the village that people used to use to go to the masjid at night for Fajr. But with the arrival of electricity, what happened is people used to stay late at night. And the number of mosque attendees dwindled. And the voice of the adhan was subdued by the drums of the new reality, was taken over by the drums of the new reality and the power of shells. That's why he talks about engraving on the wall of memory the journey of life between reality and the shells. This symbolic reference to civilization, modern civilization, as drums and shells, very loud and hollow. Very loud and hollow. Empty, fragile, fragmented. And that's the reality of human beings now. They have so many things, but they literally own Nothing. There is a book that I read called, it's by a man called Sennett. I can't remember the name of the book. Richard Sennett, yes. What's the name of the book, Sidi? Respect? No, it's a different book, Sidi. He talks about how human beings today live as mobile human beings. You find, for example, a family. The father works in Brazil. The mother and the children live in the Middle East. And they meet in Dubai. Well, there is no sense of family. Guy Eaton, many years ago, wrote in King of the Castle about what he calls the mobile environments. As a human being, we need to have a static environment. And then we can be mobile ourselves. When we're mobile and we have a static environment, we can watch our growth. You can watch your growth when there is a background that you can see the growth. You can see it to the background of your growth. But what happens when the background itself is mobile? Keeps changing. You can never notice the growth. What is happening today is that human beings have these mobile environments. Technically, they don't own anything. Property, one of the things the modern civilization has brought, is it's extremely difficult to own a property. It's extremely difficult to own your house. It's extremely difficult to own land. But what do you own? If you ask a person, what do you own? He owns a car, a mobile phone, a laptop. And these are all devalued items. They lose their value over time. What keeps its value? Property, land, and homes, isn't it? When you have a family home, the concept of family home, when you have a family home, you can go and travel and come back to the family. You know you're safe. There is a place where you can actually go to and you will never be homeless. But many young people nowadays are literally forced to be homeless, even though they are well qualified. They have well-paid jobs. They have good education. They're absolutely qualified to have established life. But technically, that established life does not exist. So similarly, at the arrival of electricity, as much as it has changed our relation to the universe and made us this kind of like drummy and hollow, he saw a decline of religiosity, a change in traditional social relationships, and a downplay of the centrality of the mosque and its rituals. It became sidelined. Similar to that, subhanAllah, I found something very interesting, even though it was a small sentence, in Shaykh Hamza Yusuf's Caesarean moon births, where he talks, like there is like one sentence that I picked there, which was quite interesting. He says, and I'm quoting, he says that the role of electric light, the role of electric lights, it played a role in changing people's thinking about the purpose on earth and its contribution to disconnecting them from the cosmos. Electricity disconnected us from the cosmos. Yes, it was, and we can talk about that at another time, how one of the signs of the Day of Judgment is actually the arrival of the electricity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ, when the sun is turned into a ball. And even though the ulama of tafsir, even though the ulama of tafsir talk about that as the arrival of the Day of Judgment and that the sun does not function anymore, but that's actually more related to our current moment, that when the sun is taken, the power of the sun is taken and put in these small lights. And because the Quran speaks about inkidaru nujum, that the stars are no more as shining as they used to be. Nowadays, people's ability to spot the stars or to see the stars or even to see the Fajr in cities is extremely difficult, is absolutely difficult. Like our big debate on whether we can see the Fajr or we cannot see the Fajr, part of it is that we live in cities. So we're struggling to find, is this Al-Fajr al-Sadiq? Is this not Al-Fajr al-Sadiq? You will never find a problem like that in places like Mauritania, for example, or places where you are different from civilization. We go to Gambia once a year, and people who come to Gambia, they can tell you how clear the skies are in Gambia. And you can see the stars at night. And it's a country with very little electricity. You can see it here. If you go to any farm that is really distant from the city, you can see that. One of the things that also Habib talks about, and I'm going to kind of like quickly touch on that, is he talks about the school. Al-Madrasa al-Maymuna, where he grew up and he became a teacher and all of that. And he sees education as something that has to be spearheaded by an individual who has a vision and he has something to offer people. He's a father. This is the purpose of education that existed in our tradition. The first school was Ahlul Sufa, established by the Prophet ﷺ. It was around an individual. All traditional education is always around an individual, right? Even nowadays, when you think about any educational initiative in the West, Muslim education initiative coming from the tradition, you will find that there is a man behind it. Like CMC, like Shaykh Abdul Hakim, or Zaytuna, Shaykh Hamza. Different places, you will find that it was the idea of an individual. It is because of this individual that the students came, and then they kind of gave it the first push, and it continues like that. Arguably, the first university in the world, Al-Qarawiyyin. Well, some say it's the second, some say it's the first, but anyway, it was an idea of a woman. Like even Zaytuna in Tunisia, the original Zaytuna, it was an idea of a man, and so on and so forth. So schools in traditional Islam have always been, traditional, like Muslim societies have always been ideas of individuals. Alim who has a mission and he comes and wherever, even nowadays, even the mobile schools, the mobile education, which we call mahdara, right? You know, the Mauritanians, they say their mahadar as on the backs of the camels. So they teach, he says, حتى اتخذنا ظهور العيسي ركبانا or something like that. Like they took the backs of the camel as their schools. Now, you see that education, that's how traditional education used to be. But what has happened is modern education is no more based on the individual. It's the public school or state school. Early education was always associated with religion, whether it's a Christian education, the church education in the West, or the masajid in the Muslim world, where schools were always associated with the masajid. Why? Because they saw education as a holistic process, where the student does not only learn information, but they have companionship with the teacher, they learn from mentoring their mentors, companionship, and they also learn akhlaq. This long companionship will enable the teacher to see the behavior of the student, to investigate, to have proximity, to know what is good and what does the student, literally to know what are the needs of the student. Summing that up, moving to modern education, you've got 10, 15 students, 30 students chucked in a class. No one knows what their needs are. No one knows what are the different capacities they have, whether some of them are good achievers and others are not. Everyone is chucked to take what they call national education. And national education is normally following national curriculum. National curriculum follows certain policies and certain priorities that the state or the government or people in power are willing to promote. So certain items or certain subjects can become non-central to the curriculum. For example, Islamic studies in some Muslim countries today, yes, they are taught, but it is not a pass and fail thing. So if you do well, okay. If you don't, so why would a person, it's almost like an optional. So why would a person spend his time studying that if they can say, well, what about computer science? Because that, if that's like an external thing, or if I have that option, I might actually opt for this because it will have a material benefit. I can do like a course on some computer language, and then I'm able to use this. I can put that as a credit. It's not helping me with my education, but it will help me with my job application later on. So you can see how education transforms our minds as well, our concept. The other thing is the education that Habib Bakr saw was an education that liberates you. It's an education that gives you ability and qualification to live a good life. While the modern education was what we call servile education. Servile system that teaches utilitarian skills required for offering the services the society needs, but deprives the students from understanding or even questioning why do they do the things they do. It does not allow you to ask, why do you do the things that you do? So if you decide to study to become an accountant, possibly not because you like accountancy, but basically because the market is in demand. It is in demand, right? So what happens? Your decision to study certain things is not based anymore on your liking or your qualifications or your abilities. It is based on what does the market want from you. That's why it is called servile education, because it's a service education in two ways. Number one, its main purpose is service, and number two, you become a servant of the market that demands from you to study this in order to be able to be employable. And this is something that I would advise God and Logic in Islam by Walbridge to read that book at John Walbridge, which has some amazing account of how colonial authorities have decided to weaken the madrasa system in India and push for modern education, like Aligarh University, which was spearheaded by Sir Ahmad Khan, who came and he wanted to create an Indian ox bridge. And he was the first one to kind of introduce the theory of evolution to that part of the world. He made his own tafsir of the Quran, trying to reconcile and so on and so forth. And the same applied for Muhammad Abdu. Muhammad Abdu, who was very, very close to some educationists in British educationists, and he came and met them. What's the name of the guy? I have to remember his name. He actually, Muhammad Abdu, came and met this famous philosopher of education. I can't remember now. It's not on top of my mind. Now, we can see that how Habib Abu Bakr sees modern education and traditional education. Modern education, where the students become, and he will talk about that. He will talk about qabdu al-ta'lim, qabdu al-ilm, the contraction of knowledge, which traditionally the ulama have seen this word of the Prophet ﷺ that ilm will disappear by qabdu al-ulama. They thought of it as the death of scholars, right? Qabd as death. But Habib gives a different dimension. He says qabd means also, qabada means to contract, i.e. that education relationship will become a contract. So your relation with the school is a contract. Your relation with the university is a contract. You pay fees and they provide education for a certain number of years in order for you to graduate. And once you graduate, it's almost like you paying for your certificate, right? You're paying for the course, where the teacher is no more a provider of education. He is just providing a service. And the student is the customer. Habib Abu Bakr is not the only one who talks about that. There are loads of, especially some Catholics, early Catholics, Irish Catholics, talk about the crisis of modern education, and some even American liberals. There is a man called Hirschkind, and he talks about he says we should be, even if we have to, he asks liberals in America to become conservative when it comes to education. He says, please become conservative, because we have what he calls an overflow of diplomas. Like people have a lot of degrees, a lot of diplomas that have lost their content and their meaning as well. It was this this kind of connection to the school that Habib Abu Bakr, that made Habib Abu Bakr perceive the graduates of the modern schools, how they have contributed to the change of minds and so on and so forth. And they became local in features, but Western in taste. This is something that Anya Lumba, for example, in colonization and colonialism and post-colonialism, she talks about hybrid identities. So this idea of hybrid identities. And the Prophet ﷺ talks about hybrid identities. Yes, Anya Lumba. Yeah, Lumba. Anya, I think it's A-N-I-A, Lumba, L-O-O-M-B-A. Colonialism and post-colonialism. This is possibly the only work in post-colonialism with the, what is this city? Right. That's his say in Ahwar. And then Adan. And as I said, Habib had to leave Ahwar, move to Adan to continue his education there, study in the Faculty of Education. So he actually did a BA in education. He had a PhD in education. And he's possibly the only Habib that I know who had combined both academic and traditional education. So he's well placed to talk about both. But in Aden, when he left, he realized that all those systems that he was grown up in has collapsed. It all has collapsed. There is no space for him anymore. He realized that his traditional studies became redundant, and that he lives in a phase of intense transitions. He moved to the city, life in a buzzing capital that widened his perspective, enriched his life experience, but his father's teachings shielded him from the psychological and intellectual changes that occupied the noisy city. Habib talks a lot about the city and the village. And obviously, this is something on the side. This is my own reflection. The Quran does not, obviously, the Quran talks about human gatherings. I don't think that I came across the word Medina in the Quran, which means city, at all. Even though there was definitely one. Mudun, there was definitely cities at the time of the revelation of the Quran. But the Quran calls every big city what? Qarya. Qarya, village. Even Mecca, which was a city, the Quran says, يقولون ربنا أخرجنا من هذه القرية الظالم أهلها. Take us out of this village. There is possibly a linguistic justification for that. Because city, which is Medina in Arabic, comes from the word bana, which means to be accountable. So in Medina, the spirit of the Medina is accountability. There is a rule of law, right? So it is authority that is harsh. While qarya comes from the word qira, and qira means banquet and generosity and feeding. It is as if the Quran is trying to hint at the foundation of human relationship, of all society, that should be helping and banqueting and giving and solidarity, as opposed to people who live in cities. This is something that you might investigate further in the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun. He talks about what links people together if they are in a city, and what links people together if they are outside of the city. He talks about the asabiyya, the tribalism, in a positive sense, not in a negative sense, that it is actually one of the most effective ways of running society. That's why when you came to Al-Andalus, for example, when Arabs came to Al-Andalus, the reason why they survived at the beginning, there was asabiyyat. But when these asabiyyat, these kind of tribal loyalties, but once these asabiyyat became intensified, then things started to fall out. When the Prophet ﷺ moved to Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara, and this is also, if you investigate the constitution of Medina, you will find that the Prophet ﷺ was promoting community spirit. And he said every community is to be left to their own financial arrangements and to their own social arrangements and to their own management. But we have almost an agreement between all tribes to defend our city. So he brought a sense of city, accountability to protect our city, but he promoted what? Community. If we put this in face of the modern arrangement of the state, where the state becomes intrusive state that interferes in every community activity, almost even family activity, we realize that the problem is we have dropped this organic arrangement. We've lost community, we've lost tradition. And now, if we want a solution at the end of times, a protection at the end of times, is to create communities. This is something that we're talking about much earlier, right? But creating communities, what we spoke about yesterday, the circles, the khuwaisa. But these communities, unlike early communities, which are based on tribal loyalties, these should be based on common good. Common good, understanding the challenge of the time. What we call intentional communities. An intentional community is a community where people come together because they believe that there is a danger, there is a problem, there is a challenge, and acknowledging these challenges, we decide to grow our children in a specific way, to make our families protected by helping each other. It's almost like people coming with their own backgrounds, with their own abilities. So someone can do education, can provide education in the community. Someone can provide health service in the community. Someone can provide finances in the community. Someone can provide, look, everyone comes with their qualifications. But the purpose of getting together is we want to rear our children in a way that they become, to save them from the facade and the fitan that is around. These intentional communities can survive only when we keep that purpose in mind. Once we lose sight of that, then the community becomes quite problematic. So that's something that Habib talks about. That he became subject, him and people like him became subject of marginalization, public humiliation, torture, and even killing. And he had to escape Yemen. At the time, he had to escape in the end. And it is this escape, leaving, which he talks about in which he talks about in his second volume of his biography, which he calls Al-Khuruj min al-Da'ira al-Hamra, running away from the red circle, talking about Yemen. And it's a very interesting journey because in about 150, 200 pages, he talks about how he left on a back of a truck, fish truck. And he had to leave. It's a very philosophically inspiring account that he writes. He said that the driver, because he was escaping, he couldn't leave Yemen, so he had to escape. He had to escape South Yemen to North Yemen. So the truck driver said to him, "You need to leave your watch. What do you want a watch for?" So he says, when people are escaping for their life, they lose track of time. He said, "What do you want the watch for? You're escaping." So he had to leave his watch. And he said he had to be on the back of a truck, fish truck, that was very bad smell. And he says, like, you were leaving a regime that has a rotten smell. Funnily enough, when he arrived in Saudi Arabia, and just on the side, why was Saudi Arabia specifically? Number one, because his father was there and his teachers have already left. Secondly, because Saudi Arabia was afraid of communism that was spreading like wildfire in the Arab world. So the Saudi regime actually took an antagonistic position from Yemen. That's kind of a well-known. And there was even a boycott between Egypt and Saudi Arabia at the time. So anyway, as he was leaving, he arrived into a completely different regime that was not better in any way because Wahhabism opposed him at the time. So he says when he arrived in a place called Al-Khadra, the first point of arrival in Saudi is called Al-Khadra, the green, right? And he said he had to jump into another van. It's kind of like there was like many stops in between, but he was in a van. This trip took about 6 weeks, by the way, moving between different places and hiding here and doing this, and this loads into it. But when he arrived, he had to enter on a van that had sheep droppings at the back. And he said, I was leaving rotten regime into another type of rottenness, moving from one society to another society. Living in two worlds, and he talks about that. He talks about how borders not only separate lands, but separate ideas, separate regimes, separate ideologies, separate societies. When he left Yemen, he started his escape in August 1980. It was his journey to save life. And as I said, he had to leave his watch behind. He said there is no need, they told him there is no need to keep time. And he was forced to stay quiet. During that journey, he makes a lot of philosophical reflections that we cannot all cover within this. But one of the things that he talks about is passing by one area in Yemen, which was on top of the mountains. He saw a house on the top. And he thought about this house being on top of a mountain, that any earthquake can move it. And he said, this is how the modern man lives his life. He builds his life on top of a mountain. Anything can make it collapse. He also mentions that he passed by an area, a village of Jews, Yemeni Jews, known as the Mizrahim, was possibly the oldest Jewish community in the world. He's passed by this Jewish community, and he said, I could see them. They are no different than any other Yemeni. You can only separate them by the side locks that they had. And he said that experience taught him how can people live together without seeing any difference between each other, if they decide that there is a possibility to work out differences for the sake of the larger good. Right? He sees that people can live in pluralistic societies, working with each other. He, in that journey as well, he talks about human will. For example, at every counter, there is an insight. So he questions human will, the will of those who decided to push Yemen down the route of Marxism, as well as his own will to escape Yemen. So these are two wills. One is to push a whole society down the Marxists' ideology, and another to go to another regime. So he questions human will. He talks about autonomous reason. He also talks about how in his travel, he said that I wished I had a keen eye, like the eye of Zarqa al-Yamama, who is known for her sharp sight in Arabia. He said, I wish I had a keen eye to know what is hidden at the turns of the journey, so that I would know where to place my step. But I had to base my movement on conjecture at times, but trust God's choice for me all the time. He moved to Saudi Arabia, moving forward. He moved to Saudi Arabia, and when he arrived in Saudi Arabia, he started helping his father with his work in a masjid as a kind of an imam. And as you know, Saudi Arabia at the time was dominated by Wahhabism. So he started his activities, teaching and attending classes with many of the senior Habib, including Habib al-Qadr who became his teacher. And his father took him to Habib al-Qadr to study with him. He wanted to study in Azhar, but his father said, no, you stay here. So he lived in a society that was antagonistic to Tasawwuf, while he was working at homes, moving from a home to another, conducting the classes, running a fully functional fatherly school. So that taught him preservation, the techniques of preservation, how to preserve in a society that's totally antagonistic without clashing with that society. Every now and then, he talks at certain places in Saudi where he was invited by the state security at certain times, or by what they call the moral police at certain times, who said to him, oh, you are a Sufi, you invite people to worship graves, you are a grave worshipper, and all of these things. And then they would say to him, oh, you're coming from a land of communism and Marxism and so on and so forth. He was a very prolific poet. So I'm going to read a poem that I almost tried to translate into a rap of his, where he basically was questioned about his loyalties and all of that. So he says, that was written in 1990, or might be even earlier. He said, they attribute me callously to strange associations. They asked, Marxist are you, an ideologue, as you come from the land of songs, prostitutes and haram, where no salah or siyam, and now you're an imam. What a ploy. To them I said, O people of peace, guardians of truth and God's house, a pride folk, in both lands I'm being wronged. So hear me once. But as I spoke, they shouted back, you're an innovator, a crazy Sufi. You worship the dead, attend the Mawlid. You sing in mosques and visit the shrine. They reminded me of the armies back in Hudaydah. That's it. Where claims are cooked, accusations are ready, judgment passed for those who do not join the ranks. So he was always living with that idea of you don't need to join anyone's ranks, because in joining ranks you are jeopardizing your loyalty to the faith. And it was because of this that he opposed sectarianism. That encounter sometime strengthened his sense of opposition of sectarianism. He saw that discord is a tool of the devil, that who has unending ploys to split human society and to instill enmity. So he opposes fragmentation. He opposes Muslims hating each other for the sake of religion that is there to promote love. In his books, he extensively talks about respecting difference, working on common ground. As I mentioned earlier, that the conference in Chechnya that was there in 2017, Habib Abu Bakr, in an open criticism to the conference and its political alignments, he issued a statement on his Telegram page, and he said that those who are in the conference, even if they are from the Hadrami school, they're only representing themselves and their own institutions, but not the Hadrami school. Staying away from the halls of politics is what he understands to be the tradition. Now I'm concluding with this statement that he wrote when he was 63. He said, I don't hate anyone. I don't hate anyone's way of thinking, school of thought or views. What I deeply dislike is using Islam and religion to serve certain purposes, make certain gains, or cover ill-intended attacks. Religion should never be used to justify hatred towards those who do not deserve to be hated. This is a strategy of inclusion. Sometimes exile strengthens, people claim that exile strengthens religious extremism. I argue the opposite. I argue that exile can only strengthen religious extremism for the ignorant who are not rooted in a tradition. But those who are rooted in a tradition, they can integrate anywhere and everywhere. The biggest migrant in history is Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam. You can read Traveling Home, Shaykh Abdul Hakim, the first article in that where he talks about the concept of hijrah, and that technically we live in a world full of muhajirs. We are all muhajirs. And the difference is when someone travels and is willing to accommodate, and that can happen only when the person has their own sureties and their own confidence in their own self. Then they travel comfortably and they integrate with people and they talk to people. But when a person does not have confidence in their own self and their own tradition, and they feel always unsure of who they are, then they don't know who they are, right? That's why, like this is on the side, and I'll conclude here, inshallah ta'ala. They say if you would like to master another language, you have to be good at your own language.